to tell a Mickey Spillane story, The Big Switch. It's one of many stories started by Mickey Spillane and finished after his death by his friend, Max Allan Collins. It was published in 2008, but the story is set in the 1950s. It's written in the style of classic 50s noir, featuring a hard-boiled private eye. So as you listen, think of it as a story from the 1950s. The Big Switch. They were going to kill Dopey Dildox at midnight, the day after tomorrow. He had shot and wiped out a local narcotics pusher for one simple reason. The guy had passed Dopey a packet of heroin that had been stepped on so many times it wouldn't take the pain out of a pinprick. The pusher deserved it. Society said Dopey Dildox deserved it too. The jury agreed, and the judge laid on the death sentence. All the usual delays had been exhausted, and the law and order governor sure as hell wouldn't reprieve a low-life druggie like Dopey. So the little schmo's time had come to fly out of this earthly coop. Nobody would notice his passing. It was just another jailhouse number. 5 feet 7 inches tall with 7 digits stamped on his shirt. On the records, his name was Donald Dilbert. Somewhere along the path laid out by snorting lines of the happy white stuff, it had gotten twisted into Dopey Dildox. A week ago, his court-assigned lawyer had written me to say that Mr. Dilbert had requested that I be a witness to his execution. And Dopey also wondered if I might stop in, ASAP, for a final chat before they throw the big switch. I was in the inner office of my PI agency in downtown Manhattan, and I handed the letter to Velda. She was my secretary and right-hand man, if a doll with all that raven hair and a mountain road's worth of curves could be so described. I sat there playing absently with the envelope while she read its contents. When she was done, she frowned and passed the letter back to me. Donald Dilbert? You mean that funny little guy who... The same, I said. The one they called Mr. Nobody. She frowned in mild confusion. Mike, he was only a messenger boy. He didn't even work for anybody important, did he? I answered, nope. He's been around for decades. He started as a messenger boy, and that's how he wound up. She arched an eyebrow. Not really, Mike. He wound up a killer. He'll wind up sitting down at midnight. I nodded, yeah, and not getting up. She was frowning again. Messenger boy isn't exactly big bucks, Mike. How could he afford a narcotics habit? I was still fidgeting with the envelope. They say if you're hooked, you'll find a way. Maybe by dealing yourself? I shook my head. No. Dopey doesn't have the brains for it. She looked puzzled. What kind of a pusher would give a guy like that credit? Nobody I know, I admitted. Something stinks about this, she replied, coming off in waves. You going to the execution? You thinking of paying him a visit first? Her voice had a strange tone to it. I glanced up from the envelope and our eyes met. We both stared and neither of us blinked. I started to say something and stopped. I picked up the letter and read it again. Very simple legalese. The lawyer was simply passing along a request. It was only a job to him. The state would reimburse him for his professional time, which couldn't have been much. Before I could say anything, Velda told me, you haven't done a freebie in a long time. Kitten, you could make it a tax deduction, Mike. Going to an execution Give this thing a quick look. Just a couple of days to you, but to Dopey Dildox, it's the rest of his life. I shook my head. I don't need a deduction. What's gotten into you? The poor slob was tried and declared guilty of first-degree murder. Now he's paying the penalty. Very quietly, Velda asked, how do you know it really was first degree? I shook my head again, this time in exasperation. There was a squib in the paper. No, she insisted. Dopey didn't even rate a squib. There was an article on narcotics and what strata of society use them. It gave a range from high-priced movie stars to little nothings like Donald Dilbert, who had just been found guilty in his murder trial. It wasn't a big article, I conceded. She continued, and Dopey was just a footnote. Still, you recognize his name, didn't you? I nodded. And what did you think? That Dopey had finally come up in the world. She stared at me. Baloney. You were thinking, how could Dopey Dildox plan and execute a first-degree murder? Weren't you? She had me, and she knew it. I had used the schlub a few times to run messages, and I'd gotten to know him just enough to recognize some of his limitations. He knew the red light that meant stop was on the top, and he wouldn't cross the street until the bottom one turned green. That type of mentality didn't lay out a first-degree kill. So, she asked. The semblance of a grin started twitching at her lips. I said, just tell me something, doll. You barely know Dopey. You haven't the first idea of what this is all about. How come you're suddenly on his side? She looked at me. Because I used to give him a couple of bucks to buy me a sandwich for lunch, and he always brought the change back in the bag. He never stole a cent from me. What a recommendation, I said sourly. She came back at me. The best. Besides, we need to get out of this office for a while. It's a beautiful spring day. The bills are paid. There's money in the bank. Nothing's on the platter at the moment, and I interrupted. And we might pass one of those wedding ceremony one-day places, right? Could be, she replied. Anyway, we could use a day trip. A day trip where? I asked. Someplace upstate. You mean a little hotel on the river? That's right, she replied. I knew what she meant. Sing Sing. A looker like Velda could have caused a riot in plenty of joints, and especially in a place that consisted of concrete cells. And anyway, the court-appointed lawyer could arrange for only one visitor. So Velda sat in the car in a lot just outside the massive stone facility, while I sat in a gray brick room in one of those cubicles with a phone and wire-reinforced glass. Dopey was a 40-something character who might have been 60. He had a gray pallor that had been his long before he entered the big house. His runny nose and watery eyes spoke of the weed and coke he had consumed for decades. His hair was once blonde and thick, but now was white and wispy. I think they must have framed me, Mike. He had a mid-range voice with a hurt tone, like a teenage boy who just got the car keys taken away. I looked into his face and spoke into the phone. And you want me to pry it off you, Dopey? You might have given me more notice. I know. With a phone to his ear, shaking his head, he had the demeanor of a guy in a confessional. Too bad I wasn't in the sin-forgiving game. So why now, Dopey? I've just been thinking, Mike. I've been going back through my whole life. They say it flashes through your brain right before you die, but I've been going through my life one crummy photo at a time. I sat forward. Was that a figure of speech, Dopey? Or are you getting at something? He swallowed thickly. I never gave nobody no trouble, Mike. I never did crime, not even for my habit. I worked hard, double shifts, never made no enemies. I'm a nobody like they used to call me. I'm just a damn inanity. He meant non-entity, but I let it go. So you've been thinking, I said. What have you been thinking? I think it all goes back to me sending that photo to LaSalle. LaSalle? You don't mean Governor LaSalle? His head bobbed. About 6 months ago, I ran across this undeveloped roll of film. It was in a yellow envelope marked Phi U April Fool's Party. I thought to myself, where the hell is this going? He continued. I remembered that night up at Salby College. It was wild. Lots of kids partying. Girls with their tops off. Crazy. When was this? I asked. He replied, 20 years ago, April 1st, like I said. I was taking pictures all over the frat house. They were staging stuff. Lots of fake murders, suicides, crazy stuff right out of a horror movie. And you got shots of some of that? His head bobbed again. I was going around campus taking oddball pictures. I even got some peeper-type shots through a sorority house window where this girl was undressing. Then this guy pretends to strangle her. It was very real-looking. In fact, it scared me silly it was so real-looking. Is that why you didn't develop the film? No. The frat guys never paid me, so I said screw it. But when I ran across that roll of film, I don't know why, but I remembered how pretty that girl was. The one who played at getting strangled. She had her top off. And well, I know how to develop my own pics. And did you? I did, Mike. And the guy doing the pretend strangling? He looked just like a young version of Governor LaSalle. So I sent it to him. I thought my eyes would pop out of my skull. You what? Just as a joke. I thought he'd get a kick out of it, the resemblance. I squinted at the goofy little guy. Be straight with me, Dopey. You didn't try to blackmail him with that, did you? Did you? No, I didn't think it was really him. Just looked like him. My stomach tightened. What if it really was him, Dopey? What if that wasn't an April Fool's stunt? He swallowed again and nodded. That's what got me thinking, Mike. That's why I hoped you might come see me. Have you told your lawyer about this? Dopey was emphatic. No. How do I know I could trust him? He works for the state, doesn't he? But Dopey trusted me. This pathetic little doper trusted me to get him out of a jam only an idiot could get into. Well, maybe I was an idiot too, because I told him I'd look into it and to keep his trap shut till he heard back from me. When will that be, Mike? It won't be next week, I said, and grabbed my hat and left. Our joint upstate didn't last long. On the way back, we stopped along the road so I could call Captain Pat Chambers of Homicide. He was waiting for us when we got back to New York, and we met at our favorite little deli restaurant down the block from my office. He was sitting in a back booth working on a soft drink, and we slid in opposite him. Pat Chambers was the NYPD's most decorated officer. He wore a lightweight gray suit that went with the gray eyes, eyes that had seen way too much. And probably too much of me if you asked him. Okay, he said with no hellos, just a nod to Velda. What are you getting me into now? Nothing, I replied. You found something? This time his nod was for me. 20 years ago, April 2nd, a co-ed from Salby College was found strangled, dumped on a country road. I looked at him. And nobody got tagged for it? He looked at me. No, this one never got solved. Interesting, I replied. Pat Chambers sat forward. Is it, Mike? You know as well as I do there's no statute of limitations on murder. If you have something, I do have something, I said, a hunch. Tell me about Governor LaSalle. His eyes opened wide. He looked at Velda for help and didn't get any. You start with a 20-year-old murder and then ask about... What do you mean, tell me about Governor LaSalle? I continued. He got elected as a law and order guy. How's he doing? Pat brushed this off. I stay out of politics. I kept pushing. What's the skinny on the gov? His voice grew quiet. You've heard the stories. Have I? I can't say anymore. I played a high card. Then you can't confirm there was an internal affairs investigation into the governor? An investigation into his relationship with a high-end prostitution ring? An investigation that got shut down because of political pressure? No. Can you deny it? No. What can you tell me, Pat? He stared at the soft drink like he was trying to will it into a beer. Then he spoke quietly. The word is, our esteemed governor is a sex addict. He uses state patrol officers as pimps. It's a lousy, stinking disgrace, Mike. But it's not my bailiwick. Or yours. I played my highest card. What about the rumors he has a little sex shack upstate? A little cabin in the mountains where he meets with female constituents? Pat's grin was pretty sick. That's impossible, Mike. Our governor's a happily married man. Then he reached for a napkin and scribbled something on it. Something fairly detailed. He folded the napkin, gave it to me, and slipped out of the booth. He said, "Get the check, Mike." Then he was gone. Velda frowned at me with curiosity. What is it? With a straight face, I said, directions. This time I took the drive upstate alone, much to Velda's dismay. But she knew not to argue when I told her there was something I needed to do, and I didn't want her to be part of it. The shady drive dead-ended at a gate, but I pulled over into the woods half a mile before I got there. I was in a black t-shirt and black jeans with the .45 on my hip, not in its usual shoulder sling. The air was cool, and the moon was full. An idyllic spring night. If you weren't sitting on death row, waiting for your last tomorrow. It was a log cabin with a single floor and maybe 4 or 5 rooms. Out front, a lanky state trooper was having a smoke. Maybe I was reading too much into it, but he seemed disgusted. Whether with himself or his lot in life, who knows? I spent half an hour making sure that trooper was alone. It seemed possible 1 or 2 others might be walking the perimeter. but security was limited to that one bored trooper. And his cruiser was the only vehicle. I was expecting the governor to have his own wheels, but I was wrong. I was positioned behind a nice big rock with trees at my back, close enough that no binoculars were needed. I watched for maybe 15 minutes before the governor himself emerged. He was wearing a purple smoking jacket and silk pajamas right out of Hugh Hefner's closet, and he had a petite young woman on his arm. He was tall and white-haired and handsome in a country club way. She was blonde and very curvy in a blue halter top and matching hot pants. If she was 18, I was 30. At first, I thought she had on a lot of garish makeup. Then I got a better look and realized her mouth was bloody, and one of her eyes was puffy and black. The bastard had been beating her. She was carrying not a purse, but a wallet, clutched in one hand like the lifeline it was. A pro doing business with rough trade like the Gov. Her gracious host gave her a little peck on the cheek, then took her by the arm and handed her to the trooper like she was a beer they were sharing. I could hear most of what LaSalle said to his trooper pimp. "Take Miss So-and-so home, then come pick me up. I want to be back at the mansion by midnight." The trooper nodded dutifully and opened the rear door of the cruiser like the woman was a suspect. Then they were off in a crunch of gravel and a puff of dust. There was a back door, and opening it with burglar picks took all of 20 seconds. The Gov wasn't much on security. I came in through a small kitchen where you could hear a shower running in a bathroom nearby. That gave me the luxury of getting the lay of the land, but there wasn't much to see. The front room had a fireplace with a mounted fish above it, a couch, a TV, and a small dining area. I spent most of my time looking around in his office, which had a desk, some file cabinets, and a comfortable chair with big cushions over by a window. That's where I was sitting, with my .45 in hand, when he came in wearing only his boxer shorts, drying his hair with a towel. He didn't see me at first. In fact, I had to chime in with, "Good evening, Governor. Have a moment for a taxpayer?" He dropped the towel like it had burst into flames, then spun around toward me, his ice blue eyes wide open. "What the hell? Who the hell?" "I'm Mike Hammer. Maybe you heard of me." Now he recognized me. "Good God, man, what are you doing here?" "I was in the neighborhood." "Go ahead, sit at your desk. Make yourself comfortable. We need to talk." His shower must have been very hot because his skin had a red tone. But the red in his face had nothing to do with his shower. He stood still for a moment. "There's a trooper on his way back here right now." I nodded. "Yeah, but he has to drop off your date first. Tell me, was that shiner and bloody mouth all of it? Or would I find whip marks under that halter top?" He had gone from startled to indignant in about a second. Now he made a similar trip from indignant to scared. I waved the gun, and he stepped over to the desk and settled into his leather chair. "What is this?" he asked. "A shakedown?" "Maybe. Your family has money. Your wife's family has even more." His ice blue eyes were more ice than blue. "Who hired you? Some little tramp get a little more than she bargained for? Then she should have picked another trade." I kept my eyes on him. "I've heard there's talk about you running for president. You really think you could keep a lid on garbage like this? He gestured with his hand. I have a checkbook in my desk drawer. I can write out a nice little settlement for your client and another for you, and we'll forget this ever happened. I just want your guarantee there will be no future payments. I shifted a little in my chair. I do have a client, Gov. His name is Dopey Dildox. He frowned. Your client is a murderer. No, Gov, you are. My client is an imbecile. He thought you might be amused by what he thought was a gag photo taken years ago. He thought the gag involved some college kid with resemblance to you. But that was no gag. You really strangled that girl. You hadn't quite got a grip, let's say, on your habit. Your sick little sex hobby. The bare-chested man leaned forward. Hammer, that's nonsense. If this is true, where are these supposed photos? Oh, hell. Your boys cleaned up on that front right after you framed Dopey. You can't maintain a sadistic habit like yours without high friends in low places. You don't know what you're talking about, Hammer. I stood up and smiled. Look, Gov, I'm not after blackmail money. All I want is a phone call from the governor. He frowned at me. What? I pointed at the phone on his desk. You're going to call the warden over at Sing Sing, and you're going to tell him you have reason to believe Donald Dilbert is innocent, and you're issuing the prisoner a full pardon. It's not that easy, Hammer. It is just that easy. Then you're calling the Attorney General and telling her that you just called the warden and that the pardon is official. And that's what he did. Under the barrel of my .45, but he did it. And he was a good actor, very, very convincing, like so many politicians. After his conversation with the Attorney General, his face seemed to relax. All right, Hammer. What now? I pardon Dildox, so this ends here? I nodded. Yes, it will. With his silver hair catching moonlight through the window behind him, he reached into the bottom drawer, came back with a .22 revolver, and fired it right at me. The click on the empty cylinder made him blink. Then my .45 was in his face. I took the liberty of removing that cartridge when I was looking around in here. Lots of firearm accidents happen at home. My left hand came around, gripped his right hand, clutching the .22, and swung the barrel around until he was looking at it cross-eyed. But there's another slug waiting, Gov. With my hand over his hand and my finger over his finger, I squeezed the trigger. A bullet went in through his open mouth, and the inside of his head splattered the window behind him, blotting out the moon. I said to the suicide, some sons of bitches just don't deserve a reprieve.